understand the way I'm introduced, so I have to reintroduce myself. My name is Bas, so please call me with my first name. No, I don't know how you do that, but my name is Bas. Yeah. Can you hear me? No? Okay, I'm not used to having microphones on my head either. Okay, so I talk in it like this, yeah? Now you can hear me? Okay, I'll keep it close. I'm a little bit moving kind of a person, so it's difficult for me to keep the microphone close to my mouth. I'm a philosopher, and I'm working at the Leiden University, but I'm not someone who has the ambition to create new knowledge. That's what most academics actually do. They do research, they find out new things, and they publish these things. That's not my ambition. My ambition is to make the stuff that's already there more understandable for many people. And I do that via books, once in a while a TV program, and articles in newspapers and that kind of stuff. And also today, I've tried to talk in a very intuitive and clear way about my last project called Plastic Pandas. But before I do that, I wish you to want to explain my method of doing things. And this picture, you see one picture, that picture is just a picture from a series. And I'm going to use some pictures to structure my talk. Yeah, so you will just see some pictures and my face, and you will hear talking. So it's not a PowerPoint presentation or whatever. And you can interfere. If you want to do that, you can do that. Or if you want to ask a question, or you want to say boo, or whatever, you're welcome to do so. Yes, it's a better way for me than just having a straight story with a beginning, a middle, part, and an ending. And if you cannot hear me, also please inform me about that, since I'm not the one who is at your place who's able to hear if you can hear me. So, first, I have my watch to keep the time. Yeah. I like to start my work with personal and rather small questions. And the first book I wrote actually started also with a very small personal question. I was a PhD student at that time in computer science. Actually, I'm a philosopher with a PhD in computer science. Can you hear me or not? No? But so I should talk even closer. You get in front. I had a discussion with a colleague of mine. Yeah, you can sit here, or even on the bench if you want to. Yeah. On that beautiful couch, the chair, you're way more comfortable. Yeah, sit there. I had a discussion at lunch with a colleague, and that colleague said, well, some of my friends are homosexual, but homosexuality is not natural, it's unnatural. That's what she said to me. I'm a heterosexual myself, but I was intrigued by this statement, homosexuality is unnatural. And I started to write a letter. I couldn't have a discussion with her during lunchtime, so since I had not at hand the right arguments to deal with this statement. I had the feeling that it's not right what she's saying, but I did not have the proper arguments at hand. So I started to write a letter to her. I did so at my desk when I returned from this lunch gathering at my desk, and I started to write a letter. But it failed. I failed. I couldn't write a letter to explain why this statement, homosexuality is unnatural, was an untrue statement. I failed. Years later, I think 2-3 years later, I finished my PhD and I had a 6-7 weeks vacation. And at some stage, after 4 weeks, I guess, I had plenty of time, and I thought by myself, okay, let's try to rewrite this letter. And the statement of this colleague of mine, of this former colleague, was homosexuality is unnatural. And as a philosopher, you should focus on the words that are of importance in that statement. And the word homosexuality is not a really very interesting word. And we all know what it means, it's not very complex. The word is sometimes a very complex word, the word is. But in this statement, homosexuality is unnatural, the word is not a very special word. The word the natural, that is a very intriguing word. It's not clear at all what this word means. So in writing this letter eventually to my colleague, I started to focus on the definition of the word the natural. And this letter actually ended as a children's book about the evolution theory. Since if you start thinking about the meaning of the word unnatural or natural, you have to dig into scientific stuff that touches that word. And the evolution theory really is the theory that is involved in the word natural. This is just to show you how I work. So I started with a personal question. So I was intrigued by my colleague saying something of which I thought that is true. I started to work, and it ended with a sort of popular scientific child book that even is translated in Russian. I'm not sure. It is translated in all kinds of, it's Korean, Polish, maybe it's translated in Russian. I don't know, but it's called Cheese and a Theory of Evolution. I just tell you this to show my method. And that's the way I work. I don't aim to produce new knowledge about the evolution theory. I just want to make it accessible for many people. And the same for the project I wish to discuss. Now, it also involves a personal question I had. And the question is, how bad is it if plant species and animal species actually get extinct? You know, we all know that the biodiversity declines on our Earth, and we have lots of plant and animal species, and they just vanish. And my question is, how bad is that actually? And that is the topic of today. And let me first is something wrong? If you can hear me, I'm fine with that. I'm not going to show you a new picture yet. This is just a picture from the book that deals with that project, and that book is there, and it's called Plastic Pandas. But let me first tell you why that question, how bad is it if a species vanishes from the Earth, is an intriguing question for me to deal with. First, my intuition tells me that it's very bad. Now, when I was a kid, I had a poster in my room, large poster, with all kinds of creatures that were on the edge of getting extinct, and I thought this is some crime. I mean, this is really a disaster, and we are the ones who are killing these species. It's our fault. This is a disaster, and I really felt horrible about that. Later, I realized, hey, there is a difference between a species that is getting extinct or an animal that is suffering. There is a huge difference between the two. I mean, an animal who suffers, that is something that I would consider bad. Suffering animals is not good. It's clear for most people. But vanishing species is something else. It might well be the case that a species vanishes without any creature suffering. For example, the pandas, they are on the edge of getting extinct. It's not that these pandas are suffering somehow. I mean, they just don't get kids, and they don't like each other so much. So, well, they vanish from the earth, but they don't suffer. So that was one reason for me to give this question that I had serious attention. So reason one is that there is a difference between the suffering of individuals and the extinction of species. These two things not necessarily go together. Suffering of an extinction can go without suffering of individuals. That's one thing I knew actually. So that was a reason for me to give this question that I had special attention. And I had a second reason to start thinking about the question, how bad is it if a species gets extinct or vanishes from the earth? And there was and the second reason was because of responses I got from colleagues from either philosophy or biology. Something very intriguing happened. When I discussed with biologists this whole question I started my research 3 years ago or something in this field. And when I asked the biologist, why is it bad that these species get extinct? Why is that so? Biologists said it's because of the intrinsic value of a species. Well, then I should explain to you what intrinsic value means. Intrinsic value means if something has intrinsic value if there is still value without someone giving it value. So intrinsic value is, so suppose that I claim that this thing, beaker, is it a beaker? What's the word for this actually? Glass, but it's plastic. But again, it's plastic glass. Suppose I say this plastic glass has intrinsic value. Well, then I claim that even if there would be no one in our universe except this plastic glass, it would have value. It has value because of itself, not because of someone who is giving it that value. So that's what the word intrinsic value means. So my biologist colleagues told me species have intrinsic value. Philosophers said something else. Philosophers said, when I discussed this question, how bad is it that species get extinct, when I discussed it with philosophers said, well, these species have a role in nature. Nature is a composition of all kinds of species, and if a species vanishes, then the whole machinery of nature might get stuck, and it might not work properly. That's very interesting. So the biologists gave a philosophical argument, referring to intrinsic value is a philosophical argument, and the philosophers refer to a biological argument. How come? Well, the reason is that for philosophers, referring to intrinsic value, that's very, very slippy. They don't do that because they know that intrinsic value is a very difficult concept, and it's even very doubtful if something like intrinsic value really exists. And if you allow something like intrinsic value, then you have to explain why species do have intrinsic value, and the car brand Toyota, for example, has not intrinsic value. I'm not claiming here that species have similar values as car brands, but they are somehow similar. They're categories, they're labeled with a word. You can compare car brands with species. And if you claim that species have intrinsic value, then you have to argue that they have intrinsic value, but car brands do not have intrinsic value, and that's very difficult. So referring to intrinsic value is shaky for philosophers, and they don't use that argument, but the biologists, they do. On the other, from the opposite side, why do biologists not say that species have this essential role in the functioning of nature? Because the biologists know that that is not true. They know that species are not particles of a nature machinery, so they will never refer to that argument, or at least they won't. They know that it's a very tricky argument, so they use a philosophical argument. So there was something very intriguing going on for me. It's all the beginning of my personal search into the question: how bad is it that a species gets extinct? And these are just two reasons for me to take this question serious. And then there is a third, final reason, a direct reason, and that was that in 2010, the United Nations, they called 2010 the International Year of Biodiversity. And biodiversity is just nothing more than the total amount of plant and animal species, or at least you can call it like that. And the United Nations said, all these creatures, they get extinct so dramatically we have to do something about that, and let's call 2010 the International Year of Biodiversity. That was for me the final reason to finally just dig into this matter and try to find an answer on the question, how bad is it really that these species get extinct? So the only thing I've done so far is just explaining you the beginning of my research. I will just now give you the conclusion of my research immediately, and this conclusion is, well, it's not nice that species get extinct, but it's not a disaster. That's my final conclusion. But now the middle part, yeah. And now I'm going to skip to my first picture. And these are actually pictures from the book, made by a very fine artistic photographer. And this is a, for me, very intriguing picture that actually explains the whole problem very clear for me. This is a picture of a natural site in the Netherlands. And you must realize that the Netherlands is a managed country. All nature is managed, and this is a very old patch of old forest near the coast, and there are all kinds of trees and plants and birds living in this very, very old, like 300 years old, I think, that this patch of nature reserve in the Netherlands is. And in this patch of land is in the 70s, there is a square area of about 100 square meters is clear cut. All the trees were gone, and a concrete bunker is put back on that beautiful nature spot. And in this concrete bunker is a collection of the very first Dutch movies. And these are very special movies that need very specific treatments and very specific temperatures, and so they have to keep them in a bunker. So this is a bunker that, and this is a picture of that bunker. So here we see something very intriguing. We see nature is gone, the diversity is gone, it's not as natural as it was before. But something we got back, we got culture back. And that's exactly what's going on. Nature is indeed vanishing, but we get something back. And that's more the optimistic perspective on vanishing of nature. It's not only a disaster, you know, our existence on Earth, also nice and intriguing things happen. And that's what this picture tells me. Still no questions? This is a picture of, it's made in the Dutch Biodiversity Museum. It's a museum that contains 2 million, no, it cannot be 2 million small items, lots of small items, all kinds of different plants and animals, and they are contained in a huge building, and a part of the building is an exhibition space. And what you look at is just boxes with plants, or maybe scallops, or what kind of things are in the boxes. It explains something very important, namely that these species are ordering a structure that we made. It's not, these things not necessarily completely exist by themselves. They're also created by us. It's ordering made by us, and this ordering is changing. So that's one thing that is happening. And just an anecdote to explain what I mean with this. When I was a kid, I collected stamps. And you know, when I was 8 years old, I had that hobby, and once in a week, I went to a stamp market. Anyone familiar with the hobby of collecting stamps? You do that, or you know that this exists, or is it a typical Dutch thing? No? Okay, but I collected stamps when I was 8 years old. And once in a while, well, sometime in my life, even every week, I went to the stamp market in the city. I went there by bus. I had 1 guilder, and I looked through all the little market stands for one particular stamp that I wanted to have, and I bought that stamp. I went back home and put it in my album. At some stage, I get as a birthday present a pile of unsorted stamps. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but it's a little piece of carton, and on the carton a pile of just unsorted stamps and a little piece of plastic on top of that, and it said 50 grams of unsorted stamps. And I thought that was a not nice, a cheap present. I mean, unsorted stamps, you know, I have to sort them, it's cheap. Or at least that was my opinion of those stamps. Then I unpacked this collection of unsorted stamps, and I started to put them in my album. And doing that, it gained value. You know, these stamps increased in value because of the ordering I gave it. And that is something that's also happening with us in relation to nature and all these creatures that live there. We order them. We put them in these species. So in doing so, they gain in value in the same way as these stamps got more value when I was ordering them in my stamp. And that is one of the reasons, probably, that these species have so much value for us. It's our stamp album that is getting smaller. That feels as a disaster, but it's partly our stamp album that we created ourselves. It's not completely true what I'm saying here. You know, it's even if you have Martians, if Martians would land on Earth and they would become biologists and they would be intrigued by our nature, they would probably also invent things like species that resemble the species that we know. But nevertheless, partly species are a human-created concept to order the world, and it's our invention that is vanishing, and it's not necessarily creatures that are suffering. Another reason to actually like one argument that people use in favor of nature and especially biodiversity is the argument of ecosystem services. And let me briefly explain to you what that means. Nature, and I want to do that actually by means of two pictures. This picture, it's dunes, and this picture, it's a dike. And it's not far from where I live, this dike. You know, it keeps me safe from the sea. It's quite a large construction of several kilometers long. Is it easier if I... Oh, that's too loud, yeah? You still can hear me, do you? Yeah. It's a large construction, and it's a straight concrete thing, and it costs about 250,000 euros to keep it in control, to maintain it. And all kinds of costs are involved in this thing. You have all kinds of people who check it, and new concrete needs to be poured in holes or whatever. All kinds of stuff needs to be done in order to keep the sea out of the Netherlands. At the same stretch, but just a few kilometers further, you have this dune. And this dune is doing the same thing for free. And that's a huge difference. So nature is doing all kinds of things for us for free. And that's the ecosystem services argument. So nature provides us all kinds of services. Nature helps us in various ways. And if species get extinct, nature cannot do that so well anymore, so it's going to cost us, so we better keep those species. Yeah, that's a very well-known argument. There's one problem with this argument, though, and that is that these services are not getting better if the number of species increases or something like that, and these services are not getting worse if the number of species decreases. You know, there's no relation, or hardly any relation, or the relation is at least troublesome, between the services that nature provides us and the diversity that nature has. So this explanation is not at all very clear. So the argument is very good. Yes, nature provides all kinds of services. We better be careful with nature. But the argument does not say that it's a very bad thing that species get extinct. Clear? Then I go to my next picture. I just like to use the pictures as a structure for today. That's not something that I want to tell about. Oh no, I do want to tell about this. This is actually, but it's just an illustration. Yeah, just something to look at and you don't even, actually what it says is that actually we should care about nature, and nature is a vulnerable thing sometimes. And I explain in my book which parts of nature are more vulnerable than others, and especially the slides of mountains, for example, are very vulnerable parts of nature. But I don't want to go into the details about this picture. Just look at it if you are bored by looking at me. What I was doing is research and my writing and thinking about nature. I at some stage asked myself, how much nature actually is there? I just wanted to know that. And I had the intuition that there was a huge amount of nature and compared to us. I thought there is so much green stuff on our Earth. How arrogant of us to think that we even can influence it. That was my intuition. And since if you go to the moon and you look from the moon to the Earth, you see lots of green stuff. But you hardly see any man-made constructions. You don't see them. That's nothing. You hardly can see a city from the moon. But the Amazon forest, you clearly can see it. Lots of green stuff. So my intuition said, well, there's a huge amount of green stuff on the Earth, and we are only small. And you can just look this number up. You can just try to find the number, how much green stuff is there. And then you should realize I'm now mixing two words, nature and green stuff. And in this case, with nature, I mean all the living stuff that we have on Earth. So it's not only forests, it's also grass, cows, fish, bacteria, us, plants that we have in our houses, all the green stuff. And you can look up the number. And the number says something like 1,000 million tons. But that doesn't say anything. Without the water, actually. Yeah, you squeeze out the water, and you get 1,000 million tons. That's the amount of green stuff on our Earth. Sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But actually it is not. Suppose that you collect all the green stuff that we have on our Earth, everything, all the stuff that's living, including the animals, and we squeeze out the water, and we change it into a carpet, a stuff on the floor, laminaat in Dutch. I don't know the English word for laminaat, but it's just an artificial covering of the floor, plastic. What? Laminaat? Okay, well then you understand it. Laminaat, yeah? Suppose you make it laminaat, and you put the laminaat back on Earth, you get a layer of only 4 millimeters. That's all. So it's only a layer of 4 millimeters on Earth with living material. And that's actually not so much. That is a very flimsy, thin layer on our Earth. And when I calculated that, I realized, okay, maybe we should not care so much about the species, since that's what my conclusion in the end is. But the amount of nature that we have is something that we should care about. I mean, it's nothing, 4 millimeters. And we must be very careful with nature, but not necessarily with the species. Okay. Then I was in Panama because my girlfriend did a research project there, and I visited her. And Panama, you should know, is rainforest. That's beautiful rainforest. That's why I showed you this picture. It's beautiful rainforest. And she is doing research in the rainforest. She's working on the Panama Canal. And I joined her for one day in a little boat on the Panama Canal, where we were just on the river. And we saw all kinds of jungle, besides the canal. And she does research in that jungle. And it's, in Dutch, there is a beautiful word for that kind of jungle, and it's called oerwoud. And oerwoud means old forest. That's what it means, old forest. And that's what we saw. You know, from the canal, we saw lots of old forest. And later that day, you know, I jumped off the boat and she went on with her research. I went to the Canal Museum. And there's you all know that Panama has this canal. And there's a museum about the canal. And in the museum, I saw pictures of the canal a couple of years earlier, say 80 years earlier, 100 years earlier. And you saw that the area was completely clear cut. The whole Panama Canal is only 100 years old. And in order to construct the canal, you had these French people and American people had to clear cut all the trees, and the whole area was just nothing, you know, it was just a stretch that you could see to the horizon. There was nothing, there grew nothing. But that was very strange. You know. So when I was there the same day, I saw old forest. And on these pictures I saw 100 years ago, there was nothing. How can there be old forest? The forest cannot be old, it's only a couple of decades old, it's an old forest. But that was actually my impression. Later, I was explained that there are two categories of rainforest. One is called primary rainforest, and that's the real old forest. And the second category is secondary rainforest, and that's the more modern, younger rainforest, without all the species. So this new forest has way, way, way less species than the old forest. And what we care about is the old forest and not the new forest, even though the new forest looks very jungly. It's really cool jungle, but it's new forest without so many species. The old rainforest, that's what we care about. And you should know that about 1/3 of the old rainforest that's vanishing is regrows as this secondary younger forest. About 1/3. That's not a figure that you very often hear. So I asked these biologists there, so, why is it a bad thing that these old forests disappear? Well, they say it's bad because the species then disappear. But why is it bad that the species disappear? Well, it's bad that the species disappear. But they didn't give an answer to my question, why is it bad that the species disappear? But why is it bad? Well, it's just bad. And they didn't have an answer. So at that stage, I decided, okay, I want to know the difference between the two forests. And there's another picture of the secondary forest, and it's not at all a proper picture. That's not secondary forest. Secondary forest looks, this is also secondary forest. It's just a zoo in the Netherlands with an artificial jungle. And if you walk in these two jungles, it's very difficult to know the difference, or at least for a layman like me. And I was there with a biologist who specialized in secondary forests, and he, at some stages, couldn't tell the difference either. So if you have a 10-year-old forest, you all know this is just shrubbery, you know, it's not a real forest. But once this forest is 70 years old, it's very difficult to see the difference. There is one huge difference, and that's the amount of species in a secondary forest. It's way lower. It's way less biodiversity. But still, it was not explained to me why it's such a bad thing that we change the one forest with lots of species for the other forest with not so many species. I still had not really an answer on my question, why should that be such a bad thing? In the end, I even now don't have a question. I go on for 10 more minutes. Okay with you? And you still don't have any questions for me, which I think is a shame, but hey. Yeah, after the lecture, that's fine. In the end, I envision a hopeful picture of what we can can do on our Earth. And I realize that we are the ones who have as the effect, our appearance has the effect that many plant species vanish. It's our effect. You cannot say it's a natural phenomenon. That's not true. We are responsible for the extinction of all these creatures. But not only these bad things happen, also in nature terms, intriguing things happen. For example, on Eiburg. Eiburg is a small new island just near Amsterdam. It's artificial land, and they created biodiversity there. They just created nature. They said, these biologists there said, okay, we want these frogs, since we like those frogs. And in order to have these frogs, we should have little waters that have these and these shapes that will guarantee that these frogs can live there. And in the end, these frogs live on Eiburg. It's even so that the amount of species on Eiburg is so large that the city ecologists, we have those, city ecologists, the city ecologists stopped counting because there are so many species on the island that it's too difficult to count them. You should know, by the way, that these species live for a large part just in the gardens of people. It's just a butterfly that lives on plants that you bought in a garden shop. That's the kind of species that this guy was talking about. So it's a kind of artificial biodiversity that we created on Eiburg, but it's still biodiversity. It's a diversity of living forms on this artificial patch of land. And I find that hopeful. And there's an even more hopeful picture. That is this picture, and that really envisions for me what the future could look like and how our relation with the future could look like. This is a picture of a so-called rondel stall. What's the word for stall in English? Shed or something like that? Or it's what? Well, it's an area between what? Barn. Barn? Okay, I call it a rondel barn. A rondel is just an invented word so that you don't understand the word rondel. It's completely irrelevant. A barn is, well, a place in this case to grow chicken. And these chicken are there for the eggs. So it's called a rondel barn, and the chicken in the barn, they lay eggs. And this barn is created in cooperation of a university, a Dutch university, an agricultural university, and some farmers, chicken farmers. And it's created such that the chickens in the barn are optimally happy. It's a kind of utopia for these chickens, given the assumption that they cannot have their eggs. Well, that's the assumption that maybe chicken would be optimally happy if they could keep their eggs, but that's not what we want. We want their eggs. So that's a constraint for this rondel barn. So we get their eggs, but we want them to be optimally happy. And this rondel barn is a construction such that they are optimally happy. And the intriguing thing is that this barn is not at all natural. For example, these chickens can walk outside, and so they have an area that they can graze on, they can do whatever a chicken wants to do outside. But there is a kind of fence on top of this area. Normally in, say, biological barns or biological chicken farms, there's not such a fence. There's not a roof. Here they have a roof. Why do they have a roof? Well, if there is a kind of fence roof, they don't need to look upstairs to look for predators. So they find it very comfortable to have that fence, and you just can observe that by means of by looking at their behavior. I'm not a specialist in that kind of stuff, but there are all kinds of specialists who know chicken behavior, and they suddenly realize, hey, these chickens are they're more happy if we give them this roof fence thing. They're behaving more happily. And they have also grass to walk on, since they they like to do that, but it's artificial plastic grass. These chickens don't care. They're optimally happy. So what do we see here? We see an environment that is artificial. It's created by us. It's not natural, but giving all criteria that I can come up with, it's a perfectly fine world. World is maybe too much, but as a metaphor for what our relation with nature can look like, I like this metaphor. And for me, this picture is not a bad picture. And if the Earth is going to change into something like this, less natural, more structured by us, but with all kinds of happy creatures on that Earth, I am not, no, I'm not disappointed. Many people would be disappointed, but not me. One final, for us, funny ending of my story, and that's this picture. This is a picture of a plastic tree, and this is not a tree at all. This is a antenna. It's an antenna for mobile phones. And I don't want to tell about this particular antenna, but it relates to the story I now want to tell. A colleague of mine, a different colleague, a colleague from the TV business, he bought a house recently. And this house is on that patch of land, Eiberg, that I showed you a small picture of. And this apartment that he bought has a view over the waters, and it's a beautiful, spectacular view over the Marker Meer, is the meer called. And at some stage, he got an electricity pole, I should say, a mast, large electricity construction in front of his apartment. I'm not sure, is the electricity here also overground or underground here in Russia? It's overground. Okay, so well, you know what kind of structure I mean. It's a metal structure that we use for that in the Netherlands. Maybe you use wooden structures here, I don't know. In the US they do. But it's a huge metal construction he suddenly saw in front of his apartment. And he thought, well, this is a shame. I used to have this beautiful view out of my apartment, and now I have this electricity thing in front of my spectacular view. What a shame. He realized that, hey, suppose that this was not an electricity construction, but a tree. What would happen with my opinion? And then he thought, okay, if this would be a tree, I would be pleased, since I like to look at trees. But then he realized, trees are not there for us to be pleased. Trees are just there, and we like them. Luckily, since if we would not like them, we would be bored, since there are so many trees on our planet. But happily, we like those trees, but they're not there for us to be pleased. And then he realized, maybe I can start to like that electricity construction. Maybe that is possible. Why do I like trees? He asked himself. And one of the answers he gave himself was, well, I like trees because I know so much about them. Okay, he realized, okay. Then I start knowing a lot about these electricity things. And he bought 3 books that are available about these things. There are 3 books worldwide, 2 German books, 1 English book about electricity constructions. And he knows everything now about these constructions. He knows the voltage, the amount of the voltage. He knows the history of these constructions, all kinds of things. And he starts to appreciate the construction in front of his house. And then he realized, okay, wait a little bit. Trees have an evolution. They change from season to season. In spring, they get green, and in the autumn they maybe get fruits or whatever, and then they lose their leaves. There are all kinds of dynamics in a tree, and these boring metal constructions in front of his house did not have that. But then he realized, hey, once in a while there is a construction team passing by, and they leave a small aluminum plate on the construction and they hammer it on to show that they checked it. And he bought binoculars just to look if they passed by. And so even this electricity construction is now a dynamic thing for him. And once in a while, some painters come by and they paint this construction. And he tracks that. So even because of that, this electricity construction is a changing thing, and it's not a static thing, but it's changing. And in the end, at least he claims, he likes these electricity constructions as he used to like trees. And it's a very strange story, and it seems to be impossible, but at least it gives a hopeful perspective. Not all the things that we do are necessarily bad things. We very often think that we make them bad ourselves. Well, it's not that the disaster really happens if some species vanish. It's a disaster in our minds. And if we look at things in a different perspective, I think, okay, then maybe this vanishing species is not the disaster that we very often think it to be. And I can read something from this book, but it's in Dutch. Who understands Dutch? It's only a few. Then I would not do that. It's about surimi. And you know surimi? Who knows surimi? Surimi is an artificial crab meat. It's as beautiful, and it's completely square, orange, pinky meat. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to tell about it. And it's artificial stuff. Actually, it's very old Korean stuff. It's a tradition of 100 years old. This surimi stuff. But for me, surimi is just as nice as crab, as real crab. If you taste well, it's actually quite good food, surimi. It's just because it's not real nature, we dislike surimi compared to crab. As if crab is there to be liked by us. No, crab is there and we like it. And surimi is also nice food. Way cheaper to produce, it's nice food. If I think about the future, a less natural future, surimi gives me hope. And I must say that a surimi future is not a future that I would be afraid of. And I think that is a nice ending so far. So now your questions. If you have any questions.